It seems like every day there's another news report about a train derailment and some kind of accident involving a train that's carrying hazardous materials that then puts human lives at risk. And this is happening more and more frequently. And because of the frequency of these events, we have to ask ourselves the question, is this sabotage? Are we possibly under attack? This is something that we have to consider based on the current global environment. And I was recently listening to Pinball Preparedness the other day, and if you don't know about his channel, I'll put a card up here to that video, but he was discussing the fact that a lot of these train derailments seem to follow a pattern that might align with the idea of eco-terroristic activities. And that is something I found very interesting. So I wanted to deep dive into that subject a little bit further and try to figure out whether or not there's any connection there or what all of this could actually mean. And what I found is that the likelihood of these events being sabotage is relatively high, and the fact that we're dealing with everything around the global stage right now should tell you that the people who are assumed to be at fault for these attacks might not actually be the ones pulling them off. So, back in the early 2000s, there was a little period of time called the Green Scare, where the federal government was actually infiltrating and surveilling environmental activist groups. They were worried about them being the #1 domestic terror threat at that time. My, how things have changed. But back then they were worried about a lot of different groups, including one called ELF, which is the Earth Liberation Front. And they were concerned about their activities because they engaged in things that resulted in millions of dollars worth of property damage, generally through the use of arson, okay? So their methods involved destruction of property using tools or arson, specifically targeting companies that were involved with things like logging, genetic engineering, deforestation, SUV production, urban sprawl, energy production and distribution, and basically anything unfriendly to the environment. So, starting to sound like some of the things that we're witnessing right now, isn't it, all right? The only problem is that ELF went largely inactive after around 2012, while peaking in their activities during the 1990s. So you would think that, okay, well maybe this group isn't involved, but this does sound like the things that eco-terrorists were involved in back in the early 2000s when the FBI was very concerned with them, right? So, here in 2023, things have changed and there's some new activity occurring. But there are some things I want to mention really quickly that we could correlate to some of the recent activities we're watching happening right now, okay? So, right now with this whole Cop City drama unfolding over in Atlanta, you have to understand that a big part of the activists down there are environmental activists, all right? And they're worried that the new facility will destroy the South River forest area, and they're worried that Atlanta will lose more of its forest because of this facility, or so that's what they're saying. And understand that arson has been used to damage property at the Cop City training facility area. So, starting to sound like this is all adding up a little bit more now, isn't it? Well, there's a lot more to this. So, back in November of 2020. So we're kind of jumping around timelines here, right? But this is important because I want you to understand how realistic this situation is. November of 2020 in Washington, 2 people were charged with terrorist attack and other violence against a railroad carrier. This is kind of interesting. What happened in 2020? Well, they had placed objects called shunts along the tracks in their area in the counties that they were operating in. And basically, shunts consist of wires and magnets that stretch across the track and then have the possibility of disabling some of the safety equipment that the train has on it. And it basically disrupts the detection systems that tells the track that there's actually a train on it. So a lot of safety systems suddenly are disabled. And these are very rudimentary devices. Like I said, it's just wire and magnets. And I believe they found some evidence of that happening when they arrested these 2 by finding a bunch of wire and some power drills in a bag, right? So this is low-tech yet high-yield equipment that is doing a lot of damage. And basically, they said that this worked and they were concerned about it to the point of it leading to other issues down the road. So what happened? Well, in October 11th, 2020, or on October 11th, 2020, because in that day would be a strange way to say that, shunts were placed in 3 locations in Whatcom and Skagit counties, Washington, okay? The shunts triggered an automatic braking system on the train that had hazardous combustible material. Sound familiar? And this caused a decoupling of the train. Now, that particular incident didn't necessarily result in a derailment or some kind of toxic disaster, but the train decoupled solely from these shunts being placed on the track, which means that this is a very easy thing to pull off for these groups that want to do a lot of damage using our railway system. Well, when else could this have possibly happened besides what just happened in places like East Palestine, Ohio, right? Well, in that same area of Washington, on December 22nd in 2020, a train was derailed in Custer, Washington, in the same exact area as all these shunts were being placed in. And the FBI immediately showed up and assumed sabotage. And they showed up wearing tactical gear and they roped the whole place off like a crime scene rather than it being a transport investigation, right? So, what happened there? Why were they so concerned about sabotage? And why was it likely to be a crime scene more than anything else, just an accident, right? Well, according to union officials, angle cocks were turned and pins were pulled. These are things that have to be manually done and aren't just easy to come loose on their own. In fact, according to some of these experts, they literally just don't, okay? So, the only way it could have decoupled and then derailed, which is what happened with that train in Custer, Washington, was by sabotage, according to union officials. That's it. That's the only way they could foresee that that could have happened. And basically what happened is that when these devices were tampered with, the train decoupled, right? And the rear of the train eventually gained more speed than the front of the train and crashed right into the back of its own train and caused a derailment and a huge amount of damage and destruction because these were oil cars, hence a toxic, hazardous material that's not environmentally friendly being destroyed in the process, okay? Of course, it put a lot of people's lives in danger. The little town there was suddenly having to deal with a huge environmental disaster. A lot of things happened, but this was back in 2020. And back in 2020, when this was happening, the FBI considered it to be most likely sabotage and a crime scene. And yet, we're seeing a lot of the same exact things happening right now, almost what feels like on a daily basis, and none of them are being treated in the same manner. So, some things we have to consider about this whole situation. And one official said this about that exact train derailment in Custer, Washington. It's very difficult to get a train to come into two pieces like this. It takes deliberate action. And while we watch footage all over the internet of trains literally decoupling while just going over a crossing over a highway or a road or wherever, for some reason, according to officials in 2020, that would require deliberate action, not just be some kind of fluke accident, all right? Now, what else could this be? Who else could be doing these things? I'm just going to tell you that Donald Trump Jr. recently came out and said that he thinks it's retaliation from our involvement with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline incident, which of course the United States is now saying was actually done by Ukraine, right? So interesting that most of the world was pointing the finger this way, and then we decided to say, actually, we did our own investigation and it turns out it's them, right? Either way, is retaliation a possibility right now based on our current global environment? I would say yeah, definitely. Why wouldn't it be? This is next generation warfare. We're not talking about the most obvious conventional warfare that we saw in the last two world wars. We're talking about next level stuff where people don't even realize what's happening right beneath their nose. Now, the other thing to consider here is that with all this happening and with the possibility of this being some kind of foreign involvement with these train derailments, putting them, I guess, together in a way that would make it look like eco-terrorism would be a great way to cover your tracks or a great way to throw off your scent if you were worried about it being revealed too soon that you had involvement. So even though groups like ELF haven't really done much since 2012, a lot of this stuff that's going on right now is starting to look a lot like things that they used to do in the past. So you can see how this could be being used as almost a disguise in function, right? So, how do we prepare for the aftermath of all this? Where does this go and how far will it go? Well, I can tell you that trains are extremely important to our logistics system here in the United States. They transport a lot of goods, and we need them especially for some of the major industrial goods when it comes to chemicals, oil, and even when it comes to things that we eat, including grain and just about everything, all right? If there becomes an issue where there's more and more disruption with our railways, when there's more and more disruption with our train systems in general, we are going to suffer from it. Cost of goods are going to go up, things are going to become much more expensive or impossible to acquire, and shortages will exist for sure. And you also have to understand that this being blamed on eco-terrorism, which hasn't been blamed on that yet, but I can see the dots being connected, and I understood where pinball preparedness was coming from regarding the situation, could eventually lead the United States government to keep pushing this whole situation more towards the idea of domestic terrorism. And unfortunately, unlike in the early 2000s, nowadays, the groups that they point to the most in these scenarios tend to be people that do things like, I don't know, prepare for things to get worse. So, we need to consider all of that moving forward, and you need to make sure that the supplies you have on hand are adequate for these types of disaster scenarios, regarding the idea that you might not have access to certain supplies or affordable supplies for a long time if this keeps going. And especially if it keeps going to the point where they have to shut down railway systems in order to ensure safety. They have to do entire inspections of track that is thousands of miles long. Who knows what has to happen, right? But these are things that are occurring right this second. Now, I will say that the biggest supporter of the channel is Midway USA, and they support what I do here, and they try their best to help me get more and more prepared. And of course, with these things happening, we know the logistics system can have some issues moving forward. So make sure you're doing what you can do now to prepare yourself as well, especially if you want sweet military surplus woobies like this one you see right here for a very affordable price. Because I think people, not all of you, because a lot of you are like old school soldier of fortune types, which I like quite a bit, but a lot of people sleep on military surplus gear because they think it's old or antiquated or used or basically not in good condition anymore. But in reality, a lot of times you're getting really high quality stuff for very cheap that still does the job. Maybe not as efficiently or maybe not with as good as form as some of the newer and higher tech stuff that's available right now, but it will do the job, which is sometimes all we need. Now, when it comes to the train derailments, I just want everyone to understand that this is all speculatory. I don't have proof that this is exactly what's happening. But when you connect the dots and you start really doing the research, you find quickly that there are patterns and that there is precedent for these things to exist. So, when you're preparing yourself in the sense of your mind, you're trying to strategize about what some of the biggest threats are going to be for you and your family, do your own research. Get in there and really try to find out what's happening. I could have just listened to what Pinball said this morning and said, you know what, he's right, this is totally eco-terrorism. And he still might be correct because, like I said, there's no way of saying for sure who's doing what right this second. But what I will say is, thanks to his conversation, I was able to go and do some of my own research and learn a lot more about the fact that these things actually have happened quite a bit, to the point where the FBI was showing up in tactical gear and roping off crime scenes in 2020, which is not the same response we're getting now, but what do I know? I'm not a law enforcement expert. All I know is that a lot of these things are happening. We're in a worldwide conflict, whether or not it's kinetic or if it's next generation or fifth generational or whatever you want to call it. Things are happening around the world, and people are mad at us that have the ability to pull off some of these events. So that should be something you're considering right this second, just based on the way things are going. And without anything else to say about it, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.